The road seemed endless. Carla had been driving for hours, and the desert landscape offered nothing but an oppressive darkness. Her body ached, her eyes struggled to stay open, and the silence inside the car was only broken by the monotonous hum of the engine. She needed to stop, but there was no town in sight, just the distant lights of passing cars that occasionally zoomed by. The night was suffocating, and the feeling of loneliness grew with every mile. Suddenly, a faint light flickered ahead, breaking through the darkness. Carla squinted to see better. A neon sign, partially out, shimmered on the horizon. Motel, she could make out between the missing letters. It was a strange and out-of-place sight, as if the motel had been forgotten by time and travelers. She hesitated for a moment. Something about the place didn't feel right, but her exhaustion was stronger than her alert instinct. If she kept driving, who knew when she'd find another place to rest? With a heavy sigh, she turned the wheel and followed the gravel driveway leading to the motel. The car shook as she parked in what appeared to be an improvised lot. The courtyard lights were dim, some flickering with faulty wiring. The place was practically deserted, except for two aged cars parked further back, covered in the dust of time. Carla turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, surveying her surroundings. There was something unsettling about that stillness. She stepped out of the car and felt the warm night air on her face. The motel building was low, with peeling paint and small windows. It looked like no one had stayed there in months, maybe years. There was something forgotten about the place, something that made her question her decision to stop. As she approached the entrance, Carla noticed a bell hanging above the glass door. When she stepped inside, the sharp sound echoed through the empty lobby, amplifying the strange feeling of isolation. The room smelled musty, and the fluorescent lights flickered, casting irregular shadows on the walls. She walked to the front desk, expecting someone to appear, but the place seemed abandoned. Minutes passed before a man slowly emerged from a back door, his steps dragging. He was thin, aged in appearance, and his eyes looked as if they hadn't seen much in a long time. His forced smile sent an involuntary chill down Carla's spine. "One night, please," she said, trying to sound normal, though her body was tense. The man nodded slowly, without a word. He reached for a key behind the counter, twirling it in his hand for a few seconds before handing it to Carla. The key was attached to a metal keychain engraved with the number 7. "Room 7, he said, his voice low and raspy. Carla took the key, mumbled a quick thank you, and left the lobby. The silence in the place was almost oppressive. As she made her way to room 7, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. She shook her head, laughing at herself. "I'm just tired," she thought. Little did she know, this would be the longest night of her life. Carla walked down the narrow hallway, the faint light flickering above her head as she approached the door to room 7. The corridor was covered in an old, colorless carpet, worn by time. The walls, once white, now bore dark stains that seemed to tell stories of decades of neglect. The air smelled of dampness and something else, something that made Carla's stomach tighten. She was trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that had been surrounding her since she entered the motel. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment, holding the heavy metal key. She looked around, but the corridor was empty and silent. No sound except for the distant drip of something from far away. She took a deep breath, inserted the key into the lock, and turned. The door creaked softly as it opened. The room was dimly lit, with only a small lamp in the corner casting a warm yellow glow over the space. The place was simple, with basic furniture. A double bed, a chair leaning against the wall, and a small, stained mirror above the dresser. However, what caught Carla's attention the most was the oppressive feeling of isolation. The room felt stifling, as if the air was heavier inside, laden with something she couldn't define. She walked over to the bed and threw her backpack onto it. The mattress sank a little, and the sound of old springs echoed through the room. There was something unsettling about the way the room seemed frozen in time, as if nothing there had changed in years. Carla wondered how many people had stayed in that very spot and what they might have experienced. She felt restless, and without realizing it, Her eyes were drawn to the mirror on the wall. It was small, oval, and framed by worn-out wood. The surface was foggy, and Carla stepped closer to clean it, trying to see her reflection more clearly. As she ran her hand over the glass, a chill crept up her spine. In the corner of the mirror, right at the edge of her vision, there seemed to be something. A smudge, maybe. But when she leaned in for a better look, there was nothing there. Carla pulled back from the mirror quickly, feeling foolish for letting her imagination get the best of her. "I'm just tired," she muttered to herself. The long drive, the strange vibe of the motel, it was all playing tricks on her nerves. She decided the best thing to do was take a hot shower and try to relax. The bathroom was small, with old tiles and a shower that creaked when she turned it on. The water was warm, just enough to calm her restless mind. As the water flowed over her shoulders, Carla tried to focus on the fact that, in a few hours, she'd be back on the road, leaving that strange motel and its odd atmosphere behind. But in the midst of the tranquility, a faint sound echoed from the next room. A soft, almost imperceptible knock, which made Carla pause and hold her breath. It must be another guest, she thought, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling growing inside her again. However, the knocking continued, rhythmic and persistent. She turned off the shower and stood in silence, waiting for the sound to stop. After a few seconds, the knocking ceased, and Carla let out a relieved sigh. But as she was about to head back to the room, a different sound echoed through the bathroom. Something that resembled a light scratching at the door of her room. Carla froze. For a moment, she stood completely still, trying to understand what she had just heard. It couldn't be that she was hearing things, but the sound had been clear enough to not be ignored. With her heart pounding, she quickly put on the robe she found in the bathroom and opened the door slowly, peeking into the room. Everything looked exactly as she had left it, except for one thing: the mirror in the corner. The lamp's light reflected a small red stain on the glass, something that hadn't been there before. She approached slowly, her body tense, and realized that the stain was a fingerprint, made of something that looked like blood. She recoiled, panic rising within her. She tried to rationalize. Maybe it was an old mark she hadn't noticed earlier. Maybe she was imagining things. But upon closer inspection, she saw that the fingerprint seemed fresh. Carla was about to leave the room and demand answers at the front desk. But the knocking sound returned, this time louder, coming directly from the wall next to her bed. She knew that the room next door was supposed to be empty. She had checked when she arrived. The feeling that something was very wrong took hold of her. Trying to stay calm, she decided to investigate. She opened the door to her room and stepped into the hallway. The hallway was deserted, just as before. Breathing deeply, Carla walked slowly to the door next to hers, room 8. She turned the knob, but the door was locked. She pressed her ear against the door and heard a muffled sound, like someone whispering. Carla's heart raced. She knew she shouldn't, but something compelled her to knock on the door, hoping for a response. Nothing. Absolute silence. The hallway suddenly felt even emptier. With a growing sense of discomfort now turning into fear, Carla returned to her room. She closed the door behind her, locked it firmly, and lay down on the bed. Exhaustion finally overtook her, but the unease lingered. She knew it wouldn't be a restful night. Carla's sleep was light, interrupted by strange, fragmented dreams. Every time she closed her eyes, flashes of indistinct images raced through her mind. Endless hallways, doors opening on their own, and the figure of a woman she couldn't quite see clearly. But it was the sound, that same knocking on the wall, that kept waking her, sweating and with her heart pounding. She woke for the third time in the early hours, the room's silence broken only by the distant drip of something, likely coming from the bathroom. Carla glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 3:45 a.m., it's still early, she murmured, trying to calm her mind. But something kept her on high alert, something that wouldn't let her fully drift off to sleep. She got up, feeling the cold floor beneath her feet, and went to the window. She pulled the curtain just enough to see the parking lot, but outside was as deserted as before. The two old cars were still there, parked in the same position. There was no movement, no sign of life other than her own. However, the silence disturbed her. There was something about that silence that didn't feel natural, as if the very air was standing still. She closed the curtain and returned to bed, determined to try to sleep a bit more. However, she had barely closed her eyes when she heard the knocking again, this time louder and closer. Her body froze instantly. The sound seemed to come from inside the room. Not the walls, but something closer, perhaps the door. She lay still, her heart racing, trying to rationalize what was happening. It's probably the wind. It's probably the old building, she thought, forcing herself to ignore the sense of impending danger. But as the knocking continued, one by one, her instinct told her there was more going on than a simple logical explanation. Carla took a deep breath and forced herself to get up again. She walked slowly toward the door of the room, clutching her chest in an attempt to control her breathing. She placed her hand on the doorknob, hesitating before turning it. The hallway's silence seeped through the cracks in the door, and the only thing separating her from total vulnerability was the thin layer of wood before her. She opened the door slowly, just a crack, enough to peer into the hallway. Nothing. The same emptiness greeted her. The hallway was deserted, the dim lights casting irregular shadows on the stained walls. Carla stood there for a moment, listening carefully. No sound of footsteps, no voices, nothing to indicate the presence of another guest or any human activity. She decided to step out to investigate. Her body was tense, each step cautious, her heart pounding in her ears. As she passed the door to room number 8, the room from which she had sworn she heard sounds earlier, she stopped for a moment. She looked at the door, expecting to see some sign that someone was there, but the only answer she received was the oppressive silence. But then, suddenly, something made her hair stand on end. A subtle, but distinct sound began to echo down the hallway. It was the sound of breathing, as if someone was exhaling slowly, long and deep, just a few meters behind her. Carla turned instantly, but the hallway was empty. She blinked, unable to believe what she had just heard. She tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, that her exhaustion was affecting her perception. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the strangeness of the place. Every minute spent inside that motel increased the feeling that something was very wrong. Returning to the room, Carla slammed the door shut and immediately locked it. She sat on the bed, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the door, as if waiting for something to knock again. Her heart was still racing, and her mind couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in that place. The knocking returned, this time more distant, almost like an echo. With every passing second, the noise grew stronger, more insistent, as if it were getting closer. Carla covered her ears in a desperate attempt to block out the noise. But it persisted, intensifying the sense that she was trapped in a place where the rules of the normal world no longer applied. And then suddenly the sound stopped. Silence returned, as abruptly as the knocking had begun. Carla slowly lowered her hands from her ears, unsure of what to expect. She sat there, on the edge of the bed, waiting for something. Time seemed to stop, and the room was now bathed in a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. At that moment, she noticed something strange. The lamp in the corner of the room was flickering, something that hadn't happened before. It flickered twice, 3 times, then went out completely, plunging the room into an unsettling dimness. Carla held her breath, her eyes fixed on the direction of the mirror, now hidden in the shadows. She felt the panic rise again, but this time there was something different. There was a presence, a palpable sensation that something or someone was watching her closely. The air around her felt colder, and a slight draft swept through the room, even though the windows and door were closed. Not knowing what to do, Carla curled up on the bed, trying to push away the feeling of dread consuming her. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't understand what. The knocking, the unexplained noises, the flickering light, everything seemed to point to a truth she wasn't ready to face. But sooner or later, Carla would have to confront whatever was lurking in that motel. The silence of room number 7 was almost unbearable. The air seemed to weigh down on Carla, as if the very environment was suffocating her. Sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes wandering around the darkened room, she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep again that night. The feeling of being watched persisted, and though the knocking had stopped, it left a deep impression on her mind. She needed to understand what was happening in that place. With trembling hands, Carla picked up her phone from the nightstand. The screen illuminated her pale face, and her fingers slid nervously as she opened the browser. Her first impulse was to search for something about the motel. Maybe there was an explanation for the discomfort she felt there, some incident or old story that explained the strange events. She typed the name of the motel into the search bar. The internet signal was weak, and the page took forever to load. Carla tapped her foot impatiently as she waited. When the page finally opened, she began to read the few results that appeared. Most were review sites, but a few links seemed to contain old information about the place. One title, in particular, caught her attention: Unsolved Mystery. Murders at Pinewood Motel. Carla's heart raced as she clicked the link, which took her to an old local newspaper article. The report was dated nearly 20 years ago and detailed a series of brutal murders that had taken place at the motel. The victims were a young couple of travelers who had stopped there during a storm. According to the report, both were found dead in the room number 7. Carla's stomach churned as she read the disturbing details. The victims had been stabbed multiple times, and the killer was never identified. The crime scene was described as bloody and gruesome, and according to authorities, there were no signs of forced entry or struggle, suggesting that the couple may have known their attacker or that the killer was already inside the room when they arrived. What disturbed her the most, however, was the testimony of a witness. A motel employee who, at the time, claimed to have heard strange sounds, knocking and whispering coming from the room, in the hours leading up to the murders. He had left the motel shortly after the incident, claiming the place was cursed. Carla glanced around the room, her stomach tight. She couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still there. Could it be that the deaths still echoed in some way in that place? The story of the couple seemed eerily familiar to what she was experiencing that night. The unexplained sounds, the knocking on the door, the feeling of being watched. Everything pointed to the same kind of unsettling presence. Determined not to let fear consume her, Carla took a deep breath and tried to focus on another thought. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Or maybe, like many old stories, the details had been exaggerated over the years. After all, she didn't believe in ghosts, right? But no matter how much she tried to convince herself, something inside her screamed otherwise. She got up from the bed and went to the window, looking outside again. The motel's courtyard was still deserted, but this time, something in the air seemed different. There was a stillness that didn't feel natural, as if the very environment was trapped in a bubble of absolute silence. She sat back on the bed, her heart still racing. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, and the feeling of imminent danger grew with every minute that passed. Not knowing what else to do, she went back to reading the article, trying to find some clue to explain what was happening. According to the article, after the murders, the motel was never the same. The owners changed several times, and the place gained a bad reputation among travelers. Some reported feeling an inexplicable presence in the hallways, while others claimed to have heard voices and seen strange shadows at night. The motel's story became a local legend, with few willing to spend more than one night there. Carla felt a chill run down her spine. Everything seemed to fit together in a disturbing way. The murders, the motel's abandonment, the haunting stories. She was in the middle of something she couldn't fully understand. She shut her phone forcefully, determined not to let fear take over her mind. But as she did, the lamp flickered again, this time so abruptly that it made Carla jump. The room plunged into a disquieting dimness, and in the reflection of the mirror, something caught her attention. In the corner of the dusty surface, the same red stain she had noticed earlier. Only now it was larger, clearer, as if someone or something was trying to leave a mark, a sign. Carla backed away, her heart pounding. Whatever was happening there was not natural. And as she realized this, she knew she had to make a decision. Stay there, trapped between fear and curiosity, or try to escape while there was still time. Her phone vibrated suddenly, bringing Carla back to reality with a start. It was a message from an unknown number. She opened the notification with trembling hands and read the brief words that appeared on the screen. "You shouldn't be here." Carla's blood ran cold. The panic she had been trying to control all night finally exploded within her. Carla stared at the message on her phone, unable to move for a few moments. "You shouldn't be here." The words seemed to scream at her from the screen, amplifying the feeling that the motel was alive, as if it knew exactly where she was. Who could have sent that? How could anyone know what was happening to her? Her mind raced with questions, but none of the answers seemed plausible. She quickly got up, feeling a desperate urgency to leave. She grabbed her backpack and started packing her things, her fingers trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. Every sound around her seemed amplified. The creaking of the wooden floor beneath her feet, the faint wind outside, the slight hum of the lights. Everything contributed to a suffocating, unsettling atmosphere. As terrified as she was, Carla knew she couldn't just run out. The receptionist was still there, and if he was involved in all of this, she thought about calling the police, but the cell service was weak, and the signal had been spotty all night. She tried to rationalize what was happening, but the pieces of the puzzle didn't fit. All she knew was that she needed to leave that place as soon as possible. As she finished packing, she heard the sound again. That same sound she had heard before. Soft, rhythmic knocks, like someone was lightly tapping at the door, trying to get her attention. She froze, holding her breath. This time, the sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It seemed to be coming from inside the room. Carla slowly turned, her eyes scanning every corner of the small, dimly lit room. The knocking continued, now louder. She felt the blood drain from her face as the sound echoed, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Her eyes landed on the mirror. The red stain that had been in the corner now spread, growing larger with each knock. "This can't be happening," Carla whispered, her voice low and shaky. She knew that what was happening wasn't normal. There was something in that place, something that didn't belong to the real world. The knocking continued, growing more insistent, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Without thinking twice, she grabbed her backpack and ran for the door, twisting the doorknob with force. When she opened it, the motel hallway was almost entirely shrouded in darkness. Only a single light at the end of the hallway flickered, casting irregular flashes of light that created unsettling shadows on the stained walls. The air felt heavy, as if it was being compressed around her. Carla hesitated for a second. The sense of danger seemed to grow with each step, but staying in the room was not an option. She needed to leave, she needed to put that motel behind her. With her backpack firmly on her shoulders, she started walking down the hallway, each step echoing in the deathly silence of the place. Every time the light flickered, shadows danced on the walls, and Carla couldn't shake the impression that something or someone was moving around her. As she approached the lobby, the light at the end of the hallway went out completely, plunging the place into darkness. Carla stopped, taking a deep breath. The knocking had stopped, but now the silence was even more unsettling. Everything seemed still, but at the same time, there was something in the air, an invisible tension that made her feel like she was being closely watched. She finally reached the door leading to the reception area. To her surprise, it was open, as if someone had been expecting her. Carla pushed the door cautiously and stepped into the lobby. The lights inside were on, but the receptionist was nowhere to be seen. The counter was empty, and the ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound that filled the silence. Carla walked up to the counter, thinking she would leave the room key there and get out as quickly as possible. However, when she got closer, something made her stop. A strange sensation, as if the air was heavier there. She looked down at the counter and saw a folded piece of paper, with her name written on it in handwriting. With trembling hands, Carla picked up the paper and unfolded it. The words were brief, but enough to make her heart stop for a second. "You are still being watched." She dropped the paper and instinctively stepped back, the panic rising inside her. There was no more time to think or question. All she wanted was to get out of there. Without looking back, she ran toward the glass door that led to the parking lot. She pushed it open with force, feeling the warm night air hit her face. The parking lot was empty, except for her car and the two old vehicles she had noticed earlier. However, now there was something different. Carla noticed that the windows of the two cars were fogged, as if someone had recently been inside. Her eyes locked on the glass, and a feeling of absolute dread took over her. There were handprints on the windows, as if something had tried to get out from inside the cars. She ran toward her car, unlocking the door with trembling hands. She got in, started the engine, and sped off without looking back. As the car sped down the gravel road, Carla glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The flickering motel sign was still there, getting farther away, but the feeling of being watched remained. Even now, miles away, she couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't entirely free of that place. Carla drove down the deserted road, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel tightly. The car sped forward, and the motel's sign disappeared further and further into the distance. She tried to keep her focus on the road, but her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and fear. The feeling of being watched, that invisible presence that had followed her, seemed to be ingrained in her skin. She glanced quickly into the rearview mirror, not knowing exactly what she expected to see. Just the dark road stretched behind her. There was nothing, no one, yet the feeling persisted. The air inside the car seemed thick, almost too heavy to breathe. Every second that passed made the terror inside her grow, as if something was about to happen. Carla tried to convince herself that she was safe now, that she had left the motel behind. But the tension in her chest didn't ease. Every mile she covered on the lonely road seemed to stretch time, and the silence inside the car was almost deafening. She turned on the radio in an attempt to distract her mind, but the static hiss only heightened her discomfort. Suddenly, a sound, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible. Carla froze. Her eyes widened as she gripped the steering wheel even tighter, her heart racing in her chest. The whisper was soft, but clear enough to be heard over the engine's noise. It seemed to come from inside the car. She looked over at the passenger seat, expecting to see something, but it was empty. The darkness outside made the interior of the car feel like a cave. Feeling suffocated, she rolled down the window, hoping the fresh air would ease her tension. The cold wind rushed into the car, but with it came a new sensation, that something had changed. Carla looked back into the rearview mirror, and this time, her vision caught something that shouldn't have been there. In the dim light behind her, a vague figure sat in the back seat. For a second, her heart stopped. The figure didn't move, but it was there. Its presence was tangible and overwhelming. She quickly turned to look directly at the back seat, but there was no one, just silence and darkness. Carla began to tremble, trying to control her breathing. "I'm imagining things," she muttered to herself. But the feeling of imminent danger wouldn't leave her. She hesitated, then looked at the rearview mirror again, and felt the blood drain from her face. The figure was back. It was a woman. Her form was blurry, almost like a shadow, but there was something deeply unsettling about her presence. Her face was partially obscured, but Carla could feel her eyes fixed on her. They were watching her, scrutinizing her every move. And then, before Carla could react, the figure began to move, slowly leaning forward. Carla screamed and jerked the steering wheel sharply, veering the car off the road. The vehicle skidded, the tires screeching on the asphalt as she fought to regain control. The car came to a sudden halt, and Carla was left panting, her heart pounding wildly. She stumbled out of the car, the cold night air burning her lungs as she tried to catch her breath. She stood there, next to the vehicle, eyes wide and hands trembling, too afraid to look back inside the car. The wind blew gently, but the silence around her was oppressive. Carla knew that something had changed since she left the motel. Something had come with her. That feeling of being watched, of having a presence following her, wasn't just her imagination. It was there, and now it felt more real than ever. She took a few steps away from the car, trying to distance herself from whatever she felt, but every move only made her feel more trapped. The fear was suffocating, and the sense of being on the brink of something terrible grew inside her. Taking a deep breath, Carla turned slowly back to the car. She needed to check, she needed to know if it was still there. She walked hesitantly to the open door and peeked inside. The car was empty, as it should have been. But the tension in the air, the feeling that something was lurking, didn't go away. Then, as she lifted her head and looked again into the rearview mirror, she saw it. The figure was standing behind her, in the middle of the road. Carla instinctively backed away, her whole body trembling. The figure, now clearer, seemed closer, more real. It was a woman, pale in appearance, with disheveled hair falling over her shoulders. Her eyes were dark and hollow, but her gaze was fixed on Carla, as if calling to her. Terror overwhelmed her. Carla turned and ran back to the car, locking the doors with trembling hands. The car's engine roared as she started it again, and without looking back, she sped down the deserted road, her heart pounding like a drum in her ears. As she drove at high speed, her hands still trembling on the steering wheel, Carla knew it didn't matter how much she tried to escape. Whatever that figure was, it would follow her. And now, it wasn't just a matter of leaving the motel behind. She was being hunted. The asphalt seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of Carla, the car roaring as she kept her foot pressed down on the accelerator. Even with the dark, deserted road before her, she didn't dare slow down. Her heart still raced, and the image of that woman, or whatever that thing was seared into her mind. She drove for some time without looking into the rearview mirror. She knew that if she did, that figure might be there, lurking. The feeling of being followed, of being trapped in something she couldn't control, wouldn't leave her. She was completely alone on that road, and yet, she felt as if something was accompanying her. Finally, after driving for many miles, Carla saw something in the distance. It was a gas station, the only sign of life she had encountered since leaving the motel. The faint lights illuminated the fuel pumps, and the small convenience store next to it appeared open, with a neon sign flickering. It was a relief, even if temporary, to see something that seemed normal and safe. She pulled the car up to the pump and turned off the engine, but didn't get out immediately. She sat there for a few seconds, breathing deeply, trying to calm her nerves. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was almost 4 in the morning. Carla knew she needed to get out of that area as soon as possible, but exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. When she finally stepped out of the car, the cold night air hit her, making her shiver. She looked around, making sure there was no one in sight. The gas station was silent, and the only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the surrounding trees. She looked at the convenience store and decided she needed a coffee, or anything that would keep her alert. She walked to the entrance of the store, and the sound of the bell above the door echoed inside the small space. The counter was empty, but the lights were on, and a coffee machine hissed in the corner. Carla went straight to the machine, pouring herself a strong cup of coffee. Her hands were still shaking, but the warm drink calmed her a little. While standing there, she looked around the place more closely. There was something familiar about the quiet and oppressive environment. The narrow aisles, the sound of the buzzing lights. Everything reminded her of the motel she had just fled. The feeling that something was wrong never fully left her. Then she heard footsteps behind her. A chill ran down her spine, and Carla froze. Slowly, she turned, expecting to see an employee or another customer. But what she saw made her hold her breath. It was the motel receptionist. He stood there, in the middle of the aisle, with the same empty look he had when he handed her the key. He didn't seem surprised to see her, as if he had been waiting for this moment. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were fixed on Carla, as if he knew more than she did. "You shouldn't have left," he said, his voice cold and low, almost a whisper. Panic took over Carla. Her mind raced in desperation. How had he gotten there? How did he know where to find her? None of it made sense, but the only thing she knew for sure was that she couldn't stay there. "What do you want?" Carla asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but fear made her tremble. The receptionist didn't respond immediately. He just took a step forward, keeping his gaze fixed on her. The silence between them was almost palpable, charged with something sinister. Then he smiled, a disturbing smile, devoid of joy or warmth. "I already warned you," he continued. "This place isn't for you." Before she could react, the lights in the convenience store began to flicker, plunging the room into a series of irregular flashes. The receptionist took another step toward her, and Carla felt her legs about to give out. Panic completely overtook her, and she turned on her heels, running toward the door. As she burst out of the store, the cold night air hit her again, but it wasn't enough to calm her frantic heart. She sprinted toward her car, keys already in hand, and jumped in quickly. When she looked back, expecting to see the receptionist following her, the inside of the store was empty. The lights were still flickering, but he was no longer there. Carla started the car, speeding away from the station as fast as she could. As she drove away, fear still consumed her. Whatever was happening to her wouldn't end so easily. She knew something much larger was at play, something beyond a simple motel or a strange receptionist. As the road stretched out before her, Carla glanced once more into the rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat when, for a brief second, she saw the receptionist again. He stood on the side of the road, watching as she drove away. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the depths of the darkness, the silhouette of the woman was back, immersed in shadows. The obvious, terrifying conclusion hit her hard. She wasn't just fleeing the motel. She was being hunted. Carla kept driving, the fear still pulsing through her veins. With every second that passed, the road ahead seemed longer and darker, as if she were moving away from reality and into unknown territory. Her body was tired, her mind overwhelmed by the events of the past hours. But no matter how exhausted she was, she didn't dare stop. The receptionist and that woman, they weren't human. Carla was sure of that now. They were like shadows, memories of something that had happened long before she arrived at the motel. An unsettling feeling crept over her, and the thought that she might never escape that cycle of horror began to take shape in her mind. The headlights of her car cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few meters ahead. There was nothing else around, just the empty road and silence. The only company Carla had was the monotonous hum of the engine, which seemed to echo in the void. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to keep going, that she couldn't stop, not until she understood what was happening. After driving for a few more miles, Carla saw something ahead. It was a crossroads, a path that split in two directions. The road to the left seemed to lead to a town, with a few faint lights visible in the distance. But something about the road to the right caught her attention. The road seemed darker, more winding, leading into a dense forest. There were no lights, no signs of life. A voice inside her, almost like a primal instinct, told her she should avoid that road. But at the same time, something inexplicable drew her there, as if the answer to all her fears lay down that path. Hesitation took over, and for a moment, Carla sat there, undecided. She took a deep breath, making a decision. She turned the wheel toward the right road and accelerated, plunging into the darkness of the forest. The feeling of being watched returned almost instantly. The trees, tall and dense, seemed to close in around her, creating a sort of natural tunnel. The darkness was almost complete, except for the car's headlights, which cast long shadows on the trees as she drove. As she drove, a strange sensation took hold of Carla. The path she was following didn't seem random. There was something familiar about it, as if she had been there before. But how? It was her first time in that region, and yet the feeling of déjà vu was undeniable. Then, without warning, the car began to lose speed. The engine sputtered, and before Carla could react, it died completely, leaving her in absolute silence. She tried to restart the car several times, but the engine gave no sign of life. Panic surged in her throat. She was trapped there, alone, on an empty road, surrounded by darkness. She stepped out of the car, feeling the cold, damp air of the forest against her skin. The silence was so deep that every small sound seemed amplified. Carla looked around, trying to make sense of where she was and what she should do. The feeling of déjà vu returned with full force. She knew she wasn't there by accident. Then she saw her again. In the middle of the road, the same pale woman she had seen in the car's rearview mirror and at the side of the road. But this time she was clearer, closer. The woman stood silently, her hollow eyes fixed on Carla. "Who are you?" Carla shouted, her voice trembling, but full of frustration and fear. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond, only continued to watch her. Carla felt a coldness spread through her body, a sense that the answer she feared was about to be revealed. And before she could react, the woman began to walk slowly toward her. Carla stepped back, feeling her heart race again, but her feet felt glued to the ground. Every step the woman took was slow, deliberate, as if she were playing with the fear coursing through Carla's body. Then, when she was only a few feet away, the woman stopped. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman said, her voice low and filled with a melancholic tone. "What do you mean?" Carla stammered, confused and terrified. "They won't let you go." Carla felt the pressure in her chest increase. The woman had said. Who were they? Why was she trapped in this never-ending nightmare? "Who are they?" Carla insisted, her voice shaking. The woman tilted her head, her dark eyes fixed on her. The silence that followed was unbearable, but soon the woman spoke again, this time with an intensity that made Carla shudder. What happened at that motel was never resolved. The souls that left, they're still trapped there. And now so are you. The woman's words hit Carla like a blow. The receptionist, the knocking, the visions. Everything made sense now. The motel was more than just a cursed place. It was a trap, a place where souls were stuck, unable to escape, and she, unknowingly, had fallen into that trap. "No, it can't be," Carla stammered, stepping back. I got out. I made it out." The woman slowly shook her head. "No one leaves. You never left." The woman's words reverberated in Carla's mind, bringing a horrible truth to light. The gas station, the receptionist, the road. It had all been an illusion. She had never really left the motel. Everything she had experienced since leaving room number 7 was part of that endless cycle of terror. Carla fell to her knees, the despair overwhelming her. She was trapped in that nightmare, in that motel, condemned to live that cycle over and over without end. Tears began to roll down her face as the truth revealed itself before her. The woman approached and knelt beside Carla, watching her with a mix of compassion and sadness. "They're waiting for you," the woman said softly. "It's time to go back." Carla looked up, unable to resist what she knew was inevitable. Her will to fight had vanished, replaced by paralyzing fear and the acceptance of her fate. There was no more escape. She stood slowly, following the figure into the darkness, knowing that her destiny was sealed. Carla walked toward the darkness, her steps slow and heavy, as if something invisible was pulling her back to the abyss that was the motel. The figure of the woman was ahead of her, barely touching the ground as she glided along the deserted road. Each step echoed through the trees around them, and the forest that once surrounded her now seemed even denser, as if it were alive, watching her every move. Her body seemed to act on its own, driven by a force she didn't understand. Though fear was still present, something inside her had changed. The feeling of being trapped, with no way out, was stronger than any other emotion. Even if she tried to fight, a part of her knew it was useless. Everything that had happened since she had stopped at that motel pointed to that moment. She was meant to return. The road continued to stretch out before them, and the darkness seemed to close in around Carla. Her mind was numbed by terror, but also by resignation. She didn't know what awaited her, but the feeling that something terrible was about to happen was overwhelming. The figure of the woman stopped suddenly, and Carla found herself frozen beside her. "This is where it ends," the woman said, her voice soft but laced with inevitability. Carla looked around, but saw nothing but the road and the darkness. There was no motel in sight anymore, but something inside her knew that, somehow, the place still awaited her. The woman turned toward her, her hollow eyes locking onto Carla's. "You still have a choice, you know," the woman said with an enigmatic tone. "Choice?" Carla replied, her voice weak, almost a whisper. "What choice?" "They want you there. They always have. But you can fight it. You can face them. Carla felt a spark of hope ignite inside her. Was there something she could do? Everything she had experienced up to that point seemed to point to one conclusion: that she was destined to be another lost soul in that cycle of horror. But now there was a new possibility, and with that, a new uncertainty. The woman stepped back, gradually disappearing into the darkness, leaving Carla alone. The air around her grew heavier, and the environment began to shift. The road she had been traveling disappeared, replaced by the familiar image of the motel's narrow hallway. The peeling walls, the worn carpet, and the closed doors surrounded her once again. The place where it had all begun. She was back. Carla felt the fear return with full force. She knew this wasn't just a simple hallucination. The motel was alive, and she was now a part of it. The knocking began again, reverberating through the walls, and this time, it came from all directions. It was as if the very building was pulsing around her, waiting for the right moment to strike. She ran down the hallway, her heart racing. The knocking grew louder with every step, and the doors along the hallway seemed to vibrate as if something was trying to break free from inside. Carla knew she couldn't stop, but she didn't know where to go. Everything around her was a trap, designed to imprison her. Then, in the middle of the hallway, she saw the receptionist again. He stood in front of her, his expression unchanged, as if he knew exactly what was about to happen. His eyes, empty and cold, watched her with a calmness that made her shudder. "I warned you," he said, his voice echoing through the walls. "You shouldn't have come here." Carla stopped, unsure of what to do. She knew running wouldn't help. She was surrounded, and everything happening around her was part of the cycle that trapped her. But there was something more. The woman had said she could fight. "What do you want from me?" Carla shouted, her voice filled with desperation. The receptionist smiled, an empty, cruel smile. He stepped toward her, and Carla felt a cold, oppressive presence fill the air. "You already know the answer," he said. "This place needs you. We need you." The darkness around her began to close in even more, and Carla felt the pressure increase. It was as if the motel was trying to absorb her, pulling her into its depths. But in the midst of that chaos, something inside her began to change. An anger, a determination, began to rise. She didn't want to be part of that place. She didn't want to be another victim. She looked at the receptionist, her eyes filled with renewed fury. "I don't belong here," Carla shouted, her voice firm, echoing through the hallway. The receptionist's smile faltered for a brief moment, and it was enough for Carla to feel that there was still a chance. Without thinking twice, she ran toward him, her body propelled by the force of desperation. He tried to block her, but at the last moment, Carla pushed him with all her strength. The receptionist fell backward, and as he hit the ground, his body began to disintegrate, as if made of dust. His figure dissolved into the air, and the knocking on the doors ceased immediately. The hallway became silent, but Carla knew it wasn't over yet. She looked toward the end of the hallway, where the door to room number 7 stood open, waiting for her. That was the heart of it all, the origin of the nightmare, and if she wanted to truly end it, she had to face it. Carla took a deep breath and started walking toward the door. She knew she was about to face something terrible, but for the first time that night, she felt like she had control. The final confrontation was near, and she wouldn't back down. Carla stood in front of the slightly open door of room number 7. That was the heart of the nightmare, the center of everything that had happened. She knew that stepping through that door would mean facing whatever was waiting for her. But she also knew it was her only chance to escape that cycle of terror. She had to end it once and for all. With her heart pounding in her chest and her breath heavy, Carla pushed the door open and stepped inside the room. The air inside felt different, thicker, as if it were charged with an invisible energy, something dark and ancient. The space seemed larger than when she had first entered, and the shadows that filled the corners of the room seemed to move on their own. She took a few hesitant steps inside, her eyes fixed on every detail. The rusty metal bed, the peeling walls, the stained mirror. Everything was exactly as before, but now there was something else in the air, a presence she could feel but couldn't see. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. The sound of a knock echoed through the room, making Carla flinch. She turned, expecting to see the woman or the receptionist again, but there was no one. The silence that followed was even more disturbing, as if the room was waiting for her to make the next move. She slowly approached the mirror, the same mirror where she had seen the red stain grow. Now, the surface was completely fogged, as if someone had wiped it repeatedly. Carla felt a chill run down her spine as she drew closer. It was as if the mirror was reflecting something else, something beyond reality. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut with a loud bang. Carla spun around, panic rising inside her. She tried to open the door, but it was locked, as if something or someone wanted her trapped inside. The knocking returned, this time more intense and constant. It came from all sides, as if the very room was pulsing with that malevolent energy. She knew she was at a crossroads. The motel, or whatever it was trying to absorb her, pull her into its dark grasp. But there was something inside Carla, a flame of resistance that hadn't been extinguished yet. She refused to be just another lost soul in that cursed place. "No!" Carla shouted, her voice echoing through the room. Then the mirror began to change. The fogged surface started to clear, revealing something behind the glass. At first, indistinct shadows. Then, slowly, the reflection of the room began to appear, but in a distorted way, as if it was showing a different version of reality. In the reflection, Carla saw figures. They stood around the bed, motionless, watching her. Among them, the receptionist and the woman, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Carla took a step back, fear tightening her chest. The figures in the mirror didn't move, but the feeling that they were about to step through the glass was almost palpable. She knew this was more than just a simple vision. It was a warning. They were there to take her, to trap her in the cycle of horror that the motel represented. "You're not going to take me," she shouted again, this time with a strength she didn't know she had. The figures in the mirror began to move, slowly, as if they were floating toward her. The air in the room grew heavier, and Carla felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. It was as if the very motel was falling apart around her. The walls seemed to contort, the shadows dancing frantically. But Carla wasn't giving up. With renewed determination, she ran to the door and pounded on it with all her strength. The wood groaned but didn't give. She hit it again and again, feeling adrenaline surge through her body. She knew she had little time before the figures reached her. Then, in a final act of desperation, Carla threw her body against the door with all her strength. The wood finally gave way, and the door burst open with a crash. She fell into the hallway, her knees hitting the hard floor. Without wasting any time, she got up and started running. The sound of the knocking behind her grew louder, as if the figures were closing in fast. But she didn't look back. The hallway seemed to stretch for miles, each door closed, each shadow seeming like a threat. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, but Carla didn't stop. She knew that if she looked back, she would be lost. She had to get out of that place. Finally, the motel lobby appeared ahead of her. The empty counter, the flickering lights, and the glass door leading outside. The door that represented her only chance of escape. She ran toward it, her lungs burning, her legs tired, but she didn't slow down. When she reached the door, she pushed it open with force, and the cold night air hit her like a shock. Carla sprinted across the parking lot, the sound of knocking now distant, as if it were fading behind her. The lot was empty, except for her car, the only sign of life in that desolate place. She got into the car and started the engine, her hands still trembling. She glanced one last time at the motel, expecting to see the figures lurking in the windows or the door. But the building was completely silent, as if nothing had happened. The neon sign flickered, and the place looked as run down as it had when she arrived. Carla didn't waste any more time. She hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The panic was still there, but the feeling that she had managed to escape began to take hold of her. She had won. She didn't know how, but she had gotten out of that place. But as she drove, something nagged at her, a feeling she couldn't ignore. She looked into the rearview mirror, just for a second, and her heart stopped. In the back seat, the woman was there, her eyes fixed on her, just as hollow and dark as before. Carla screamed and jerked the steering wheel violently, causing the car to skid on the deserted road. Everything became a blur for a few seconds, and then, the impact. The car spun and stopped, the world around Carla spinning with it. Silence fell, broken only by her heavy breathing and the distant sound of something dripping. She opened her eyes slowly, still dazed. She was back in the same place as before, the same spot on the road where it had all started. Carla looked around, her eyes wide with terror growing inside her. The motel was there, in front of her, as if she had never left. The sign flickered, and room number 7 awaited her. She had never really left. The cycle was starting over again.